September of 1944. On the map, Peleliu was just a small coral dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But here, thousands of soldiers entered a nightmare they would never forget. American generals had promised to take the island in 3 days. In fact, the battle lasted more than 2 months, turning the island into a graveyard. Entire companies were wiped out. Some units suffered as many as 78% casualties. For many veterans, Peleliu was not a victory, but a wound in their memory. A warning written in blood, a reminder that in war, blind confidence can kill more people than artillery. In the summer of 1944, the United States was holding the upper hand in the Pacific War. One by one, islands in the Gilbert, Marshall, and Marianas archipelagos fell to American forces. The Japanese Navy, once considered invincible, was now exhausted by the loss of too many ships and planes. In this context, 2 powerful figures argued fiercely about the next step. General Douglas MacArthur vowed to return to the Philippines to make up for the defeat of 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted to skip the Philippines and attack Okinawa directly. President Franklin Roosevelt chose to follow MacArthur, and to protect this campaign, Peleliu was considered a mandatory target. A decision that seemed reasonable, but in fact opened the door to one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a decisive phase. The United States had already fought its way across the vast ocean, smashing through island strongholds in the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and most recently the Marianas. Each victory came at a terrible cost, but each also pushed Japan closer to the edge of collapse. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a force that terrified even the most seasoned admirals, was now bleeding ships and aircraft at a rate it could never replace. For American commanders, the question was no longer whether Japan would fall. The real question was how to strike in a way that ended the war swiftly, while sparing as many American lives as possible. At the highest levels of Allied strategy, 2 towering figures clashed over the next step. General Douglas MacArthur, who had retreated from the Philippines in early 1942 with a solemn vow to return, was determined to redeem that promise. For him, the liberation of the Philippines was more than a military operation. It was a matter of national honor, a pledge to the Filipino people, and a way to restore America's standing in Asia. Beyond sentiment, MacArthur argued that retaking the Philippines would cut Japan off from its vital lifelines to oil and raw materials in Southeast Asia. In his eyes, there was no path to victory that did not pass through Manila. Standing opposite him was Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the Central Pacific Drive. Nimitz believed that the Philippines, though symbolic, were not the most efficient stepping stone to Japan itself. He advocated bypassing them entirely, striking instead at Formosa, modern Taiwan, and Okinawa. In his view, such a move would shorten the war by directly threatening the Japanese home islands, forcing a quicker surrender. To Nimitz and his staff, the Philippines risked dragging American forces into a costly and unnecessary diversion. The debate reached the desk of President Franklin Roosevelt in the summer of 1944. On the volcanic soil of Hawaii, Roosevelt convened both MacArthur and Nimitz to hear their arguments firsthand. The president listened patiently as MacArthur spoke with passion about duty and honor, while Nimitz laid out charts and timelines promising a faster endgame. In the end, Roosevelt sided with MacArthur. The Philippines would be liberated, and to shield MacArthur's advancing armies, the islands of Peleliu and Angaur, part of the Palau chain, would first need to be seized. Even as orders were drawn up, dissenting voices warned of disaster. Admiral William Bull Halsey, a man famous for his aggressiveness rather than caution, urged his superiors to reconsider. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese air power in the Palau region had already been broken. The airfields on Peleliu, Halsey argued, no longer posed a serious threat to MacArthur's campaign. Why, he asked, should Marines die on a coral rock that offered so little? His warning was blunt, almost prophetic. Why waste Marines? But Halsey's counsel was dismissed. The operation had momentum, units already assigned, timetables already set. The landing would go forward. The seeds of tragedy had been planted before a single shot was fired. While American leaders argued, Japanese forces under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa transformed Peleliu into a fortress. Nakagawa had studied Japan's earlier defeats carefully. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, Japanese troops had hurled themselves in banzai charges against American firepower, only to be slaughtered in their thousands. That doctrine of death before dishonor had proven disastrous. Nakagawa resolved not to repeat those mistakes. Instead, he embraced a new strategy, defense in depth. Rather than defending the beaches to the last man, his 11,000 soldiers would yield the shoreline after inflicting initial losses, then fall back into the jagged ridges of Peleliu's interior. There, in terrain tailor-made for defense, they would bleed the Americans white. The heart of his defense lay in Umurbrogol Ridge, a maze of limestone cliffs, coral outcroppings, and dense jungle. Nature had carved caves and crevices throughout the ridges, and Nakagawa's engineers expanded them into an interconnected web of bunkers and tunnels. Some positions were reinforced with concrete and steel. Many were invisible until they opened fire. Heavy machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces were hidden behind narrow slits in the rock, almost impervious to bombardment. If one bunker fell, others covered it with overlapping fields of fire. At night, troops could slip through tunnels to reappear in unexpected places, striking from the shadows. Even the beaches, though no longer the main line of resistance, were carefully prepared. Mines and booby-trapped shells were buried in the sand. Camouflaged bunkers waited to unleash sudden fire. Their role was not to hold the shoreline but to stall the invaders, to kill enough Marines in those first minutes to shatter morale. Then, as survivors pushed inland, they would be funneled into the killing grounds of the ridges. Nakagawa told his men to fight not for glory but for time. Every hour they held, every American they killed, was one more delay in MacArthur's timetable. Each soldier was instructed to kill 10 Americans before he himself was slain. It was a cold, calculated form of attrition, designed to break the enemy's will. By September of 1944, Peleliu had become one of the most formidable defensive positions in the entire Pacific. For the Marines preparing to land, much of this remained unseen. From their perspective, Peleliu was just another step on the long march toward Tokyo. They believed overwhelming firepower and courage would prevail as it always had. What awaited them instead was a nightmare, a new kind of war where caves became fortresses, ridges became graveyards, and an island thought to fall in 3 days would resist for over 2 months. At dawn on September 15, 1944, the first wave of Marines braced themselves inside landing craft as naval guns thundered behind them. For 3 days, American battleships and aircraft had pounded Peleliu. Columns of smoke rose from the ridges, giving the impression that nothing could have survived. Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, was confident. He told his men the island would fall in 3 or 4 days. The Marines believed they were about to mop up scattered resistance. But as the first amphibious tractors ground onto the coral sand, the island came alive. Hidden steel doors swung open, and from the black mouths of caves poured a torrent of fire. Heavy machine guns raked the beach with deadly precision. 47mm anti-tank guns smashed landing vehicles, setting them ablaze and spilling men into waist-deep water already boiling with shrapnel. In minutes, 60 amphibious tractors were destroyed. The shoreline became a choking graveyard of burning metal and bleeding men. On the northern flank, Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Marines were pinned down by fire from a rocky headland that would become infamous as the Point. Shells shredded command posts, cutting communications and leaving companies blind. To the south, the 7th Marines waded through chest-high surf under sheets of bullets. Many never reached dry land. Only the 5th Marines in the center advanced far enough to seize the airfield by midday. But there, Colonel Nakagawa unleashed his one armored counterattack. Japanese light tanks rolled across the runway with infantry close behind. For a moment it seemed the Marines might be driven back into the sea. Then American Shermans roared forward. Naval guns offshore and dive bombers overhead joined in. Within minutes, the Japanese armor lay in burning ruins. By nightfall, the Marines held a foothold barely 3 kilometers wide and 1 mile deep. The price was staggering. 200 dead and nearly 1,000 wounded in a single day. If the beach was a slaughterhouse, the point was a nightmare all its own. On September 16th, Captain George Hunt and Company K were ordered to seize the rocky headland that dominated the landing zone. 200 men scrambled forward, expecting to take a single bunker. Instead, they stumbled into a hornet's nest. Machine guns crackled from every crevice. Grenades rained down from hidden pits. With few heavy weapons, the Marines fought with thick rifles, grenades, and sheer determination. One by one, they stormed pillboxes, blinding defenders with smoke and finishing them with grenades. Hunt's men silenced 6 nests and even a 47mm gun in desperate close combat. By noon, against all odds, they held the point. But Nakagawa understood its importance. For 30 straight hours, wave after wave of Japanese counterattacks crashed against Hunt's exhausted company. Ammunition ran low, water ran out. Men fought hand to hand in the dark, swinging rifles like clubs, stabbing with bayonets, even hurling rocks when bullets failed. One Marine later recalled, "It was like fighting demons in the night." When dawn finally broke, only 18 of Hunt's original 235 men were unhurt. 75% lay dead or wounded, yet the point remained in Marine hands. Elsewhere, the 1st Marines moved into the Umurbrogol Ridges. What awaited them was worse than anything they had faced before. Every advance drew fire from interlocking caves. Medics and stretcher-bearers became deliberate targets for Japanese snipers. At night, infiltrators crept into foxholes, slitting throats or tossing grenades before vanishing back into tunnels. Sleep became impossible. Marines dug 2-man holes so one could watch while the other dozed. Puller's regiment was ground down company by company until by early October it had lost nearly 60% of its strength. The proud 1st Marines, once the tip of America's spear, were effectively destroyed as a fighting force. No episode captured the futility of Peleliu better than Captain Everett Pope's assault on Hill 100. Believing he had reached his objective, Pope led his company up a rocky slope under constant fire. By nightfall they dug in, only to discover they were beneath an even higher summit bristling with enemy guns. Reinforcements never came. Through the long night, Pope's men endured repeated counterattacks. When ammunition ran, 2 out, they fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, even loose rocks ripped from the ridge. By dawn, only 9 Marines remained standing. Pope later received the Medal of Honor, but his company was destroyed. By late September, with Marine regiments shattered, General Roy Geiger committed fresh troops. The U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, came ashore to relieve the exhausted Leathernecks. At first they believed their mission would be simple: strike into the rear of the Umurbrogol and finish off the defenders. Instead, they too were swallowed by the nightmare. Every ravine was a trap, every slope covered by interlocking fire. In a place soon called Death Valley, entire companies were cut down trying to cross open ground. Tanks bogged down on coral ridges, easy prey for hidden artillery. Engineers blasted caves with explosives, only to watch new gun ports open yards away. The Wildcats fought with courage, rotating fresh battalions into the line. Marine Corsair fighter bombers flew from Peleliu's airfield, blasting caves with rockets and napalm. Slowly, yard by yard, the defenders were crushed. But Nakagawa's men did not break. They clung to their labyrinth, determined to make every American casualty count. By mid-October, the Marines were withdrawn entirely, leaving the Wildcats to finish the fight. Peleliu had become one of the most drawn-out and costly island battles of the entire Pacific campaign. By mid-October 1944, Peleliu had become a charnel house. The Marines had been withdrawn, their regiments shattered by weeks of grinding attrition. Now the burden of the campaign rested entirely on the shoulders of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats. Unlike the Marines, the Army could rotate fresh battalions into the ridges. Yet even with manpower advantage, progress came in feet, not miles. The Umurbrogol Massif, quickly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge, remained the heart of Japanese resistance. Every cave was a fortress. Engineers blasted one entrance only to see defenders reappear from another tunnel yards away. Napalm and satchel charges collapsed some bunkers, but others endured days of bombardment. Casualty evacuation was agonizingly slow. Wounded men often lay exposed for hours under sniper fire, their cries echoing through the night until stretcher teams risked their lives to reach them. Inside the caves, the Japanese lived like ghosts. With supplies dwindling, they rationed water by licking condensation from stone walls. Ammunition was hoarded for close-range ambushes. At night, some slipped from tunnels to scavenge rations from American dead, disappearing back into the labyrinth before dawn. Despite starvation, they fought with lethal precision, obeying Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's command to resist to the last man. Nakagawa himself embodied this grim defiance. His reports to Tokyo remained steady even as his command shrank from thousands to hundreds. He noted when weapons were destroyed, when the regimental flag was burned to prevent capture, and finally when nothing remained but duty. Facing inevitable defeat, Nakagawa and his surviving officers committed ritual suicide. Their final act left scattered remnants to fight on until they too were killed. By late November, organized resistance collapsed. American patrols hunted holdouts through the ridges, blasting caves one by one. On November 27, 1944, Peleliu was declared secure. The campaign had lasted over 2 months, far longer than the 3 days promised by General Rupertus. The cost was staggering. Of the 11,000 Japanese defenders, more than 10,900 were killed. Barely 200 survived, most of them non-combatants or laborers. For the Americans, over 10,000 Marines and soldiers were killed or wounded. One Marine regiment had lost nearly 70% of its strength. Peleliu was among the bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War. And yet, when the smoke cleared, commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. The island they had sacrificed so much to seize contributed little to the larger campaign. MacArthur's advance into the Philippines proceeded regardless of Peleliu. The airfield, the supposed prize, was scarcely used. In hindsight, Admiral Halsey's warning seemed prophetic. Peleliu had been unnecessary. Thousands had died for ground that was strategically irrelevant. For survivors, the battle was not remembered as a victory but as an ordeal. Veterans spoke of weeks under crushing heat, thirst, and constant fear. Temperatures soared above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Many collapsed from heat stroke as often as from enemy fire. Water supplies remained tainted with oil for days, forcing men to choose between dehydration or foul liquid. Even the island itself seemed hostile. Jagged coral shredded boots and skin. Every ridge concealed death. Every night carried whispers of infiltrators with knives and grenades. News of Peleliu barely reached the American public. Overshadowed by MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines and by massive offensives in Europe, the battle became the forgotten chapter of the Pacific. Only decades later, through memoirs and historians, did its brutality come fully to light. Marines who survived often ranked Peleliu as worse than Tarawa or even Iwo Jima, not because the fight was longer or larger, but because the sacrifice seemed wasted. Strategically, Peleliu served one dark purpose. It revealed Japan's new doctrine of defense in depth. No longer would defenders hurl themselves in futile beach charges. Instead, they would build hidden fortresses designed to bleed attackers dry. That lesson would soon be repeated on a larger scale at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where casualty lists climbed even higher. Peleliu was the first warning, and it was written in blood. For Japan, the defense showcased both the ferocity of its soldiers and the blindness of its ferocity of its sea leadership. An entire division had been annihilated for an island already irrelevant to the broader war. Their sacrifice delayed the Americans only briefly, yet it destroyed one of Japan's best-trained formations. For the United States, Peleliu stood as a monument to hubris. Commanders underestimated their enemy, ignored clear warnings, and paid in blood. The price was borne not by admirals or generals, but by young Marines and soldiers who fought and died on coral ridges. In the end, Peleliu's legacy was not one of triumph but of caution. It reminded future generations that in war, miscalculation can cost more than battles. It can cost lives that no victory can ever justify. The battle for Peleliu ended not with triumph, but with silence. What had begun with confident promises of victory in 3 days dragged into more than 2 months of agony. Over 10,000 Americans killed or wounded, nearly every one of the 11,000 Japanese defenders annihilated. And for what? An airfield barely used, a coral island that proved irrelevant to the greater campaign. For the men who fought there, Peleliu was not a stepping stone to glory but a scar. Survivors carried memories of unbearable heat, thirst, and the endless fear that death lurked in every cave. They remembered comrades who never came home, entire companies wiped out in the ridges of Umurbrogol. They remembered promises from commanders that this would be quick and easy, promises that turned to ashes as reality swallowed them whole. History often overlooks Peleliu. Overshadowed by MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines and by the great battles in Europe, it became the forgotten fight. Yet those who endured it never forgot. To them, Peleliu was worse than Tarawa or even Iwo Jima, not because it was larger, but because the sacrifice seemed for nothing. And still, Peleliu mattered, if only as a warning. Here, the Japanese perfected their new doctrine of defense in depth, a strategy that would turn future islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa into slaughterhouses. The United States learned that overwhelming firepower could not erase the cost of underestimating a determined enemy. Peleliu became the first grim lesson, written in blood. In the vast story of World War II, Peleliu stands as a symbol of miscalculation. It shows that pride and flawed strategy can demand terrible prices from ordinary soldiers. In the memory of World War II, it reminds us that not every victory is worth the lives it consumes. And in the enduring legacy of World War II, Peleliu teaches us that the greatest duty of leaders is not to win ground, but to guard the lives entrusted to them. For those who dream of peace, justice, and freedom, Peleliu remains a warning. Never let ambition blind us to the cost of human life.